I was feeling a little down recently. And I hate complaining as a student, but it's pretty hard to just sit down and study all day. And I've been thinking about it. And I've realized something very interesting. I have an iPad and it's great, but technology is just a tool. And it's just an extension of who you are and what you do. And so instead of giving you another tutorial today, I thought I might tell you a bit of a story. And it's a story of how I went from a student who used to just study to do well in exams, to an individual who's beginning to learn and to think for himself. For me, school was a bit of a love-hate relationship. I really liked the social aspect of school and interacting with other people. But when it came to schoolwork, if there was anything that I could actually claim that I liked, it would be assignments. And the reason why I liked assignments was because I felt like I could do my own thing. From science, where I'd research some interesting topic and then make my own report out of it, to presentations where I'd work on my verbal communication and try and be really creative with my visuals, all the way to history posters where I'd take tons of information from textbooks and the internet and I'd craft my own little thing out of it. And I never really cared how long it took me to do that because it was fun. It really motivated me because I was making my own thing. And when I made my own thing, I actually learnt it and I wouldn't forget it. And to be honest, that's probably the only aspect of academic learning in school that I enjoyed. Most of the time, I had to study, and I hated studying. And I've spoken a bit about this on my channel before, where, I tried to be really creative and make handwritten notes and do my own thing. But honestly, it was such a waste of time. It was such an inefficient method of study. Because at the end of the day, there was always a test or an exam. And when it came to tests and exams, all I cared about was getting good grades. And I absolutely hated losing marks. And it's sort of hard for me to admit this, but as a student in school, I used to really pride myself in getting good grades. Getting good marks made me feel really valued. They sort of made me feel like I was something special. I mean, when you think about it, that's the way we quantify success for students. So I basically optimized my life as a student to get good marks. And I realized that if I could sort of work out what was in the exam and understand how they would mark it and revolve my studying around that criteria, I could do pretty well with not too much work. So I'd pull out the syllabus and I'd take every dot point and make, these summaries that I would regurgitate. And when I was doing essays for exams, I knew that the marker only had a limited amount of time to mark that essay. And I was able to work out that they look for certain things in that small amount of time. And all I needed to do was hit those main points. And so for me, school was just this process of, doing the right things, having a bit of discipline, and just meeting the criteria. And as nice as that sounds, the sad reality of the scenario was I was actually being rewarded for regurgitation, not learning. And although I didn't realize it at the time or could articulate it, I think deep down inside I felt it, and I hated it. But I still did it because I was afraid that if I did anything else than what was wanted of me, I'd be punished. And just when I thought it was all over when I finished school, and I had this illusion in my mind that I'd never need to study again, I rocked up at my first semester of university, and I've spoken about this on my channel before. I was blown away by the amount of work I had, the expectations, the depth of understanding that they required of me, and honestly, school was nothing compared to university. And I remember in my first week going up to my biology lecturer in shock and asking him, "Excuse me, sir, there is so much content here. How do I know what's going to be in the exam?" And I remember he didn't even answer my question. He just looked at me and said, "This is not school, this is university." And I think that summed up my experience in university. It was a slow humiliation. And I remember sitting in one of my lectures and it hit me. I did not know how to learn. And taking that a step further, this thing called studying that I've been doing all my life was actually not allowing me to learn. And as much as that was a shock to the system and a humiliation to admit to myself, like a failure as a student essentially, it was probably the greatest realization I'd ever had in my life as a student. And I remember that day onwards, I made a decision in my life that, I need to do something about this. It's not every single day that a tool comes around that so drastically revolutionizes the way you do things. But that's what the iPad did for me. You see, the thing was, I kind of got in the habit of spending hours on YouTube watching how to study videos made by other people. And yeah, they were helpful, but eventually I kind of got to the stage where I didn't need any more study advice. I didn't need to watch more videos. I just needed to try things out. And in the middle of all this, there was something about the iPad that appealed to me. Because as a student who hated sitting down and studying all day, I believed it could make that process just a little bit more fun and enjoyable. And I remember using it for the first time with the pencil. And something in my mind clicked. Now, if you're thinking that all of a sudden all my problems went away and I became some academic success, the funny thing is, the exact opposite happened. And I actually failed pretty badly. For example, I had this subject called biodiversity, and I remember taking really pretty notes for this subject for like 5 weeks. And I actually didn't learn anything because all I was doing was just directly copying the textbook and attempting to summarize it in the process. And if you would ask me, like, Samuel, like, what are you actually learning about? I wouldn't be able to answer you because, I wasn't actually thinking. And I was all right with that. I was okay with failing, because at least I worked out that, this method of studying doesn't work for me. And to be honest, like, I was just having fun. And occasionally, I'd try something different and it would actually work. For example, I was in an anatomy lab one day, and I've spoken about this in the previous video. While all the other students in the class were tracing diagrams of the structures they were showing us in class, I took an image of it and annotated it myself. And I remember doing that at the time, and it was a really weird feeling for me because I was actually engaged with the content that I was learning, which was something I didn't really have most of my life. And if there's like one thing that I can credit the iPad for when it comes to how it impacted my mindset as a student, I can say that it's the fact that it encouraged me to try new things. Because the experience of trying out new things on the iPad is such a rewarding thing. And I have a great example of this. And I think it was my second semester in university, and it was a biology lecture, and we were learning about the parts of the cell. And I was with a group of friends at the time, and they were pretty smart students. They'd done biology in school, unlike me. And I remember sitting in that lecture and seeing my friends take all the lecture slides and basically copy-paste the information from those slides into a Word document. And then to fill in the gaps of information that the lecturer pointed out, they just threw in some textbook definitions. And the plan was that I was going to take all the information of this Word document and sort of organize them into testable flashcards on an app called Quizlet, if you've heard about it before. And that was how we were going to revise for that exam. And I remember them telling me, like, this is the most efficient way to revise in university. And I remember going home that night and pulling out that document and looking at the words on that page. And I remember thinking, this makes no sense to me. There is not a single word on that page that has any meaning in my mind. Like, that's just random information. I'm not going to memorize this and just regurgitate it. I've done that for 12 years. And I've hated it. And I thought, I'm going to try something different. And I remember that evening pulling out YouTube and searching up, parts of the cell. And then I watched a couple of videos. And I started to realize, wow, this actually makes sense. All these little organelles, these parts of the cell, work together and have their own specific function that help the cell do what it needs to do. And I was actually quite excited. And it was at that point where I was like, I need to make something out of this. And I remember pulling out my note-taking app on the iPad, and I was like to myself, I think I should draw this. And so I decided to draw my own version of the cell. And I remember making so many mistakes. I had to literally redraw every part of the cell multiple times to get it looking decent. And it wasn't even that fancy in the end. It was just a simplified, dumbed down model of the cell. But it was my cell. And that's what mattered. And what's crazy is that I realized that, do you know that thing that I used to do back in school with assignments, making my own thing? That's what I was doing on the iPad to learn, making my own thing. I remember taking it to university the next day and showing one of my friends. And one of them told me, Samuel, if you spend all your time making pretty notes, you won't have enough time to study. And I remember telling him, I don't need to study because I've learnt it. Every single word on that page is a part of my vocabulary. I could talk to you for an hour about it. And I did this for a couple of weeks, and I started to realize that I was understanding things at a level of depth I'd never touched on before. I was remembering things because, as I said, these words became a part of my vocabulary. And I was going into tests and exams, and I was doing better in them than back when I was in school, when I only studied to do well in the test and in the exam. And the funny thing is, it actually didn't feel like work. It didn't feel like I was studying. And that's because I was learning. And my mind loved it. And something really special happened when I started to learn. I fell in love with teaching. Teaching is great. Not only is it such a great way to learn and revise, but it's also a great way to help out other people and socialize and talk about the things that you're learning. And I loved teaching my friends. I used to book out these classrooms and have these little group study sessions. And something very interesting happens when you teach your friends. Because number one, they don't care about your feelings, which means number two, they tend to be very honest with you. And whenever I teach them, they'd always ask me, Samuel, why do I need to know this? Why should I care? And what's the point? And do you know what the crazy thing is? After teaching a bit, I realized that that's actually the most important question. That question in school that all the so-called dumb and lazy students ask? Why do I need to know this? Because if you can answer that question, and if you can make what you're teaching relevant to your students' life in some way, they actually become super interested and curious. And once they're curious, honestly, as a teacher, that's 50% of your job done. Teaching students helped me realize two things. Firstly, that all students are different, and the questions that they ask are different. Because everyone's at a different stage in their life and they have a different foundational understanding of that content. And my fixed lesson plan and the textbook's prescribed structure was actually not the right approach to help them learn. And the second thing that I realized was, when I let the students' questions, when I let their curiosity drive the learning process, when I gave ownership of the learning process to the students and let them take it in the direction that they wanted it to go, I realized that they were able to learn at a shockingly fast rate. And I spoke about this in a previous video as well. Basically, I tried to embrace curiosity in my own learning process. Now, the thing about curiosity is that it's a bit messy, it's chaotic. It's spontaneous. It doesn't just go in one direction. And that's why it's hard to be curious in school. It's why it's hard to ask so many questions in a lecture. That's why it's hard to make sense of a textbook, because those forms of information are rigid and structured in one particular kind of way. And although they might make sense to some people, it won't work for everyone. And it was out of these experiences that I was having as a student that I realized that learning was a process of breaking things down and building things up. In the same way that you break food down and then food eventually becomes a part of what you are as a physical person. And this process involves curiosity because you should ask questions, and creativity because you can express yourself in that process, and actually thinking, and individuality because everyone's a little bit different, and the way that they go about learning will be a reflection of that. And as much as I'd love to end the video there on a high, I think there's something very important that I think you should all know. all my life, the system of education that I was a part of never rewarded me for learning. In fact, I would say they punished me for learning. I mean, think about it. Who actually gets good marks and good grades in our education system? You see, all my life, when I think about it, especially in my final years of school, I was rewarded for being compliant. I was rewarded for regurgitation and memorization, avoiding risks and eliminating risks. I was rewarded for not making mistakes, and I was punished when I made them. It was always about meeting the criteria and fulfilling the criteria. And the thing that's always bothered me is, if the only thing that you're able to do is be compliant and meet the criteria, that's all you'll ever be able to do for the rest of your life. When I thought of studying, that's what I thought of, those ideas and those values. And I think that's what most students think of as well. And that's why the only question you hear asked is, will it be in the exam? And I think it's a very sad question because it tells you why they do what they do. And I know what that feels like because that's how I got marks in school. That's what I've been rewarded for all my life. But I have to say that there is no curiosity, no creativity, no individuality. In fact, we punish students for learning, and we punish those who speak up against these ideas. And I remember feeling very sad and bitter about this one day. And I was talking to a professor of mine at my university. And I remember asking him, if the education system is so messed up and is as bad as we've said it is, what am I as a student meant to do about it? Because at the moment, all I feel like doing is complaining. And I remember he gave me 3 words of advice or encouragement or whatever you want to call it. And I want to share those 3 words with you today. And it's own your learning. Own your learning. And there's so much to that phrase, from, owning the knowledge that you're being taught and making it your own thing. I don't care if that's through making notes or through teaching someone or through doing questions, and own that process for yourself. Instead of asking, will it be in the exam, ask yourself, why do I need to know this? And be curious and make mistakes and take risks and be creative and express yourself. Instead of receiving an education, you can take ownership of it. And instead of complaining, which is something I've always done, you can take responsibility. And instead of studying, you can begin to learn. And as much as I talk on my channel about the iPad and technology, at its core, this is what my channel is actually about. And to be honest, the only reason why I love the iPad, and I've said great things about it, is because, I genuinely believe that as a tool, it empowers you to own your learning. But just to round off the video, if you're struggling at the moment, and I know that some of you are, I just want you to know that I've been doing this every single day for the past 2 years, and I haven't worked it out. And I'm still learning how to learn. And in all honesty, it's a struggle for me every single day, especially right now. And I'll continue to struggle, but that's okay. Because I was telling this to someone the other day, but I'd much rather prefer the struggle of learning over the shackles of studying. And I hope you do as well. That's it. I'll see you in the next video.